a handshake that resolved nothing, a border that keeps bleeding billions, and one prime minister who looked the most powerful man on earth in the eye and said, "Not on your terms, not like this, not yet. Stop whatever you are doing right now. Put the phone down, close the other tab." Because what is unfolding between Ottawa and Washington right now is not a headline you scroll past. It is a decision that will define whether Canada enters the next decade as a sovereign nation or as an economic dependent. Here is what we know. Hundreds of billions in trade, millions of jobs, one negotiating table, and a July 1st deadline that is now weeks away, and one prime minister who has spent the better part of a year telling Washington, "We are not rushing. We will not take a bad deal just to end the pain." Some call that resolve. Others call it the most expensive calculated bet in Canadian history. I am going to walk you through exactly what has happened, what it means, and what comes next. But first, if you are not subscribed, do it right now. Hit the bell, turn on notifications, because this story is moving fast and you do not want to be catching up when it breaks. Let me set the scene. Mark Carney is not a conventional politician. This is a man who ran the Bank of Canada, then ran the Bank of England. He has sat in rooms where a single sentence can move global markets. He understands leverage. He understands timing. He understands exactly what it means to walk away from a table. And over the past several months, he has walked, waited, and walked back more than once. Here is what actually happened. After winning the federal election this spring, Carney visited the White House in early October 2025. Senior U.S. officials inside that meeting were reportedly enthusiastic about a possible agreement covering steel, aluminum, uranium, and energy. Negotiators on both sides were told to put a framework on paper, with the goal of finalizing an interim deal before American Thanksgiving. Canada looked like it might actually get there, and then everything collapsed. Not because of economics, not because of a legal dispute. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's $75 million U.S. ad campaign, featuring archival footage of Ronald Reagan denouncing protectionism, upended Canada-U.S. trade talks in October 2025 when President Trump, angered by the spots airing during the World Series, cut off negotiations and threatened an additional 10% tariff on Canadian goods. Carney, speaking from an overseas summit, confirmed he had advised Ford not to run it and apologized directly to Trump, but the damage was done, the table was empty. Now let me translate what that moment actually revealed, because in diplomatic terms, a trade negotiation that collapses over a television commercial was never just about the commercial. It was a signal about who Canada is actually negotiating with. Before Trump launched his tariff war, roughly 76% of Canada's exported goods went to the United States, while just 17% of U.S. exported goods were destined for Canada. That is not a trade relationship built on equal footing. That is a dependency. And every time Canada makes a move, however well-intentioned, the response from Washington is unpredictable. Here is where the stakes become very real. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement has its first mandatory joint review on July 1st, 2026, 6 years after its entry into force. And right now, with that date weeks away, the United States is continuing discussions with Mexico while Canada has effectively been iced out of formal trade talks, with less than 2 months until the countries must agree to extend the agreement or trigger annual revisions. Think about that. The clock is running. The table is not fully set. Canada's chief trade negotiator says the July 1st date should not be viewed as a hard deadline, noting that some trade points will not be entirely resolved by that date. That framing may be accurate. It may also be the best available way to describe a situation where Canada has limited short-term control over when formal talks begin. Carney has vowed that the Americans alone will not dictate the terms of whatever deal is struck, insisting this process is a negotiation that will require some U.S. concessions to Canada before Ottawa and the provinces make their own moves. 5 words that every trade analyst in Washington has been reading carefully. Now, here is where the picture gets more complicated. And I need you to stay with me, because what I am about to show you changes the whole frame. Everyone watching from the outside sees a standoff. Canada holds firm, Washington applies pressure. Both sides wait. That is the surface reading. But underneath it, 3 things are happening simultaneously that almost nobody is connecting together. First, the negotiation is happening on multiple tracks right now. Despite the freeze following the Reagan ad incident, Canada's minister responsible for trade and the U.S. Trade Representative continued to communicate by phone throughout the period when formal talks had stalled. The public messaging and the back-channel engagement have been running in parallel the entire time. That is not a contradiction. That is a strategy. Second, Canada has been actively building alternatives while waiting. In a significant break from U.S. alignment, Carney cut Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles in return for lower Chinese tariffs on Canadian agricultural products, establishing an initial annual cap of 49,000 Chinese EVs entering Canada, and securing a commitment that China would begin investing in the Canadian auto industry within 3 years. This is what negotiating theory calls building your botna, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. The stronger your alternatives, the less desperate you look at the table, and the less desperate you look, the better the deal you can extract. Third, the CUSMA review itself has become the arena. Rather than pursuing standalone sectoral deals on steel, aluminum, and autos, Carney has signaled those conversations will roll into the broader CUSMA renegotiation as the July deadline approaches. That is a fundamentally different negotiating posture than chasing individual relief. It means everything gets resolved together or nothing gets resolved at all. Now here is the part nobody in mainstream coverage is talking about. Everyone is asking the same question. Will there be a deal? When will there be a deal? What will the deal look like? That is the wrong question. The better question is whether any agreement reached under current conditions can actually hold. And that question takes us somewhere most coverage is not willing to go. The U.S. Trade Representative has said the United States may need to take steps to formally signal exit from the North American Trade Pact in order to continue negotiations past July 1st, describing it as a procedural move rather than a terminal withdrawal. Let that sink in. The pathway to extending the conversation may formally look, at least on paper, like walking away from it. This is the negotiating environment Canada is operating inside. Despite all of it, 3 in 5 Canadians still say they prefer a firm approach and holding the line on difficult concessions. Canadian resolve has ebbed and flowed, but has remained above 60% since July 2025. The public is not panicking, but the public also is not living on a trade negotiator's timeline. Let me bring this down to ground level, because everything covered so far, the diplomatic chess moves, the sovereign fund, the BATNA framework, that is the 30,000-foot view. You are not living at 30,000 feet. At ground level, this dispute has a very different texture. Start with manufacturing. The Canadian and American auto industries are not 2 separate industries that happen to share a continent. They are one deeply integrated production system divided by an international border. A Bloomberg analysis found that Canadian exports to the United States dropped 5.8% last year, led by lower volumes of vehicles, steel, aluminum, and forestry products, dragging real GDP growth down to 1.7%, the lowest rate since the economy shrank in 2020, though Canada still avoided recession. That is not a theoretical number. That is the actual cost of 2025 already paid. Windsor, Ontario, Oshawa, Brampton. These are not abstract policy locations. These are communities where the auto sector is not one employer among many. It is the employer. And workers in those communities are not analyzing long-term strategic realignments. They are watching their industry absorb costs every single day. Now, here are three scenarios I see playing out from here. These are analytical frameworks, not predictions. Scenario 1, the deal before the deadline. Formal talks between the US and Canada begin in late May as signaled. Enough common ground exists to reach a framework agreement by or shortly after July 1st that provides meaningful tariff relief on key sectors while leaving deeper structural questions for a longer renegotiation. Carney's patience is vindicated. Canada gets relief without having surrendered its negotiating position on the bigger picture. Scenario 2, the slow bleed. Talks formally begin, but drag well past July 1st with no breakthrough. Under this path, CUSMA would be reviewed every year until an extension is negotiated or the agreement expires in 2036, prolonging uncertainty for businesses and exporters indefinitely. In this scenario, the cost of patience becomes very visible and very personal for a lot of Canadian workers and families. Scenario 3, the decoupling. Canada continues expanding trade relationships with China, Gulf states, and European partners, while CUSMA negotiations grind forward slowly. The China EV deal is a first step. New diplomatic capital built in the Middle East and Asia-Pacific generates actual trade volume over years. Canada arrives at a future negotiation with the United States from a position of reduced dependency and therefore genuine leverage. In this scenario, every move made in 2025 and early 2026 that looked like a hedge was actually the strategy. Here is what keeps me thinking about this. Carney's actions do not fit cleanly into any single one of those three scenarios. He is running elements of all three simultaneously. Quiet diplomacy for Scenario 1, trade diversification for Scenario 3, and public resolve specifically designed to prevent Scenario 2 from becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy through panic. That is either masterful strategic ambiguity, or it is three strategies running in parallel because nobody yet knows which one will work. And the difference between those two interpretations matters enormously for every Canadian household trying to figure out what is coming. Here is the deeper issue that deserves honest examination. Mark Carney comes from a world where institutions matter, where signed agreements create binding obligations, where a legal framework once established provides a stable foundation for economic planning. That is the world of central banking and international financial architecture. The current White House operates from a fundamentally different framework, one where trade is a competition, a zero-sum contest where surpluses are victories and deficits are defeats, where leverage is the only language that produces results. These are not just different negotiating styles. They are different theories of how economies actually work. And if Canada secures a new agreement, that agreement will be written in the language of integrated supply chains and mutual benefit. But will an administration that views trade as zero-sum honor, an agreement built on the logic of mutual gain? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the central practical problem. A majority of Canadians disagree with the argument that Carney is stalling negotiations to score political points domestically, and most continue to believe that a bad deal would be worse than no deal at all. But majorities and policy timelines do not always move in the same direction. Before I go, 3 questions, no answers. Not yet. 1. With formal Canada-US talks expected to begin this month and July 1st weeks away, what does it mean that the United States opened formal negotiations with Mexico first? Is that sequencing, or is it something more deliberate? 2. Carney's $1 trillion infrastructure investment target for Canada by 2030 depends heavily on CUSMA renewal going well this summer. If talks stall past July, what happens to that promise and the confidence of the private sector that is supposed to help deliver it? 3. Canada cut EV tariffs with China to generate leverage. Washington has already threatened additional tariffs in response. Does that move buy Canada room at the CUSMA table? Or does it cost more than it gains? I do not know. Nobody does yet. Here is what I do know. This story is not over. It is not close to over. The July 1st deadline is approaching fast. The next move could come this week. Subscribe, turn on notifications. Because when this breaks, and it will break, you will want to have been here from the beginning, not catching up on it the morning after.